We have a small but august crowd tonight. We are working on this last section of the major part of the book of Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah together, as we've said a few times, kind of have a four-part theme where we're looking at Zerubbabel, who comes and wants to rebuild the temple. And then we're looking at Ezra coming and trying to get things straightened out and runs into problems there. Then Nehemiah comes along and wants to rebuild the wall. Then we've got Ezra again, and we're kind of in that last section where we're trying again to get the people to rededicate their hearts to God. We've looked at how this is a coming back out of captivity, how these people understand what went before them. And last week we looked at that national prayer that they had and that service that they had where they read the word and they realized that they just had not been conforming to what God said. And so they renewed a covenant. They got it together and said, this time we're going to make it work. And everybody signed up, and there's just a whole chapter of names of people who signed on to this, the leaders of the people who said that they were going to now abide by God's word. So that is something that they would have been looking forward to as a group, as a nation, coming back out of this captivity, trying to reestablish what they felt would be God's kingdom. And they're still running a little short, and they're still having difficulties. And so as we progress through that, and we're going to start tonight in kind of chapter 11, we're going to be looking at the way that they started getting people into the land and some other things associated with repopulating things and dedicating the wall and several other activities. But we're getting down close to the end of when Nehemiah is going to be there as governor. And so this section, when we get through that and we're ready for that last chapter, there's a big transition there, and there's several things that we want to look at. But we're going to look at chapters, hopefully 11 and 12 today. And if we get through that quickly, which we probably will, since 90% of the material is just names that none of us can pronounce, and that, then we'll start looking at how this book closes out. Let's have a word of prayer before we start. Father, we're so thankful for the day that you've given us, for this time that we can be here. We pray that as we look into these great books that you've given us, that we'll find not only that these ancient words tell the great story of your people and the difficulties that they had, but will help us to understand that your will has always been for us to follow you, and that only in being submissive to you can we truly accomplish the good that you want from us. And we pray that you will help us to see that in this, and that we will find things that will help us as we live each day. If we pray in Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So we think about this covenant and the multiple things that they said they were going to do as part of it. And they said they were going to obey the Sabbath. They said they were going to have all kinds of following God's laws, provisioning the temple. Those were all kinds of pieces that they'd had difficulties with that they specifically said, we're going to do all of this. Not getting in advance here, so we might want to make sure I've got the control there on the booth there. Is it? Yeah, we're not going. Yeah, well, you can, but let's see if just doing that. I may have to yell and have you do it for me then. That or we'll find another piece. Let's try one more time. Yeah, this one's not working. Is that one working? All right. I would pick up the bum one. Probably a battery change. Thank you. All right. Chapter 11 deals with how they're going to start spreading people out and start trying to repopulate the land. Now remember, they're coming out of Persia. The Persian kings are still going to want something from this area. The kings are going to want it to be prosperous. They want the economy to thrive. To do that, they've got to rebuild a lot of stuff. Remember, this place was devastation. When Zerubbabel first comes, there's nothing there. And they finally get the temple going, but then they're having a hard time with their lives. It takes them years before they finally get around to rebuilding the wall. They've got that done now. Now that they've got some security, and Ezra has set up some civil forms of government, they're now looking at how do we populate this and how do we distribute things. And So it talks about the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9/10 remained in other cities. I always found that kind of interesting. Can you imagine people, it's like, we're going to vote on where you get to live. Okay? We cast lots, and I'm sorry. Y'all got to leave your nice rural home and move into this city that's been just now had the wall rebuilt. Yeah, I know it might not be the safest with all the people who don't want this wall here, but we've got to have some people that live in the city. This is going to be the beginning of the administration. They would need people to do all of the things that needed to be done to get this place up and running. And so they started picking people and start repopulating. But notice in verse 2, and the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. So apparently there's a group that went, you know what, that's what's needed, we'll go do it. And it wasn't quite enough. And so they went, too bad, we got to pick a few more. And so there were others that were voluntold to move in. But as the heads of the provinces who lived in Jerusalem, but in the cities of Judah, each lived in his own property in their cities, the Israelites, the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, and the descendants of Solomon's servants. Some of the sons of Judah and some of the sons of Benjamin lived in Jerusalem. From the sons of Judah, and it lists a whole bunch of names. And I'm not going to go through all of the names here, but what I wanted to show you on the map was when they're coming back into the land, at one time, this little river down here, the Wadi El Arish, that's known in the Old Testament as the River of Egypt, okay? It's not really much of a river except in certain seasons where it does flow a little bit when they get some rain, so they just call it a wadi, which is just a river. All the way up to way north up here where it's not even on the map, up to what was Dan, right? So remember the old from Dan to Beersheba? The area that Solomon had controlled that was once part of this has shrunk. All they got is this little bit right here during the Nehemiah's time. And as we talked about the enemies that they had around, we got a lot of Samaritans up in here where the 10 tribes used to be. All this is most of the area that the tribe of Judah had and some of the area that the tribe of Benjamin had. Even the tribe of Benjamin, which had been down in here, is gone. Judah had much of this land here. Jerusalem now, instead of being kind of on the north end of the Judah's area, is almost smack in the middle of all that they've got left. So when you think about Solomon's kingdom, and yeah, if you bring in a world map and look at it on a world map, Solomon's kingdom wasn't very big either, but it was bigger than this, right? So even on that scale, what do we got left here with these people coming back? This isn't much. This is just a very small area that they've come back to. And even when you start reading how many, they brought 10,000 with them or 11,000 people, it's still a kind of a large area to populate that, right? I mean, yeah, okay, San Antonio's one of the larger cities in the U.S., but have you ever thought about how many people live here? And most of you are familiar with 1604, the giant ring that goes around. You drop that ring down, and you catch ballpark 1 million people inside of that ring. Now, what's interesting, you take that same ring and you drop it around a city like Seoul, South Korea, and you catch 14 million people. So we're not as densely populated as that. But there's some places in West Texas where you drop that ring, and how many people do you think you'd catch? About 4 and about 1,400 cows, right? So there's obviously some differences there, but this had been at least a prosperous area, and now they're trying to rebuild it, and there's just not many of them. So they're working on getting the people to keep the temple going while also beginning to rebuild the commerce in the land. And most of chapter 11 is all about getting people situated and who's here and which roles they're going to play. And then in verse 20, it starts about outside Jerusalem, and it starts talking about the rest of Israel, the priests, the Levites were in all the cities of Judah, each on his own inheritance. Now, I found that kind of interesting because the people had been keeping track while they're in exile of where their boundaries for their clan inheritance should be. Now, can you imagine if you were growing up in first Babylon and then under Persian control in that area, and one of the things that your father would pass along to you was, son, when you get there, and you've traveled 3 miles beyond, of course they didn't use miles, but whatever it was, beyond the oak that's in the bend of the river, we own from there over to, whatever the next landmark would be, and they would have it all designated as to who had which place. And you'd faithfully write it all down, and then you would look at it and say, but I've never seen this, have no idea what's there, but that's my inheritance. And a lot of them were anxious to get back to their inheritance, right? So they're going back to the land thinking, okay, this is ours, this is our families, and we're going to get this thing going again. And I think that there would have been some both excitement and disappointment there as well, too. What has happened to this land over 70 years? And you have ever been to one of these like ghost towns or something like that where just suddenly people left? And we were driving through out in Death Valley. There's a place called Titus Canyon that you could drive through, and there's some turn-of-the-century places where there were thriving little villages and towns for the gold mining and whatnot. And then, of course, there wasn't anything really there to do, and they all moved out. Guess what happens over a period of 10, 20, 30, 40, and now we're talking hundreds of years from when everybody left? What does the Earth tend to do to things like that? Sort of reclaims them, right? If they had any houses, how many of them you think were still standing? If it was like when I used to go visit my relative places back in some of the backwoods of Alabama, what you would see is a kudzu field with a chimney sticking in the middle of it, right? House is gone, roof's gone, roof caves in, the house is gone, but there's a chimney. That was built out of brick or stone or something like that. And I'm kind of envisioning that's what they're going back to, is they're anxious to reclaim things, but there's not much there. So there's still a lot of work to do. And as they're moving back, it says, now the overseer of the Levites in Jerusalem, lists the name of Uzzi and Merari and so on, and the sons of Asaph, who were the singers for the service of the house of God. So each of them have some roles they have to play, but even these singers, they're rotated in, and that's part of what you get from the context when you're reading through, is it talks about the Levites and the singers and all of the ones in the temple, but as you read what David had set up, there were courses of them. There were people who lived in different places, especially the Levites. Remember, they're living in different towns scattered through. Not many of those towns left here in this little portion. All the ones that were in the north are gone. The ones that are south are gone. There's just this little piece left. But even there, what they're supposed to do is they have a set of months or weeks that they're supposed to serve, and the ones that are there go back to their place, and they rotate through. Now, when they had a big country and Solomon set all that up, it talks about him, and he set up by months and where they're going. This is a smaller group, right? So they're either going to have to serve longer or rotate more. But all of this is in trying to get things set back up and going again. And so it lists a lot of names and the villages and the towns. Many of these places we know where they are, and they're close by in Jerusalem. Many of them we really don't. Archaeologists haven't found evidence for all of these cities yet. But you keep going until you get to chapter 12. And it says that the priests and the Levites who came up with Zerubbabel, and it starts listing all of them again. And for a while, you just think there's nothing but names here in these last couple of chapters. But he's trying to get you to understand that these were real people. And some of these names, and we're not going to take the time to do it, you can cross-reference to other places and the families that they came from. And I think what you get when you look at this is the rich sense of history that these people had. And they knew who their forefathers were. We were recently up in Indiana working with Debbie's family. She had a suitcase full of old pictures, some of them dating back to the late 1800s. And one of the goals was to try and figure out who these people were. They were known to be mostly in the family somewhere, right? But what their names were, what their occupations had been, this was all to be delved out and to explored and recorded and figured out. And that's only a few generations. And these people were trying to track back where I know that I'm a descendant of Levi, hundreds of years, because that was important to them to know where they came from. Well, they're getting there, but they're still having difficulties. But eventually it finishes up with that, and it starts talking about in verse 27 of chapter 12 is where I want to kind of pick up, that it's time for them, they've got things kind of organized, and that's what the previous chapters are about. It's time to have a ceremony. And when I read through this, it's again, we're going to highlight some things. I'm not going to read all the verses here, but it reminded me again, why do we have ceremonies? What kind of things do we have ceremonies for? Okay, weddings. There's typically big ceremonies at weddings, right? What else? What's that? Funerals. We got ceremonies for funerals, right? What do we do every 4 years? We don't have an inauguration of a president. We got one of those coming up, right? For good or for ill, whatever your side is. We got one of them coming. Why do they make such a big ceremony out of it? Part of it is tradition, importance, right? Part of what we do when we say how important something is how much time and energy and expense we're bound on marking that. And so a ceremony is designed to bring something to mind, to make a solemn statement on an occasion. In the military, you have some short ceremonies that happen daily, right? What happens every day as a ceremony in the military? What happens when you get up in the morning? You got reveille. What's that say? I'm sorry, you guys are finished sleeping, it's time to get up. But isn't that interesting when you think about that happening at every base, every military installation around the world? That's the ceremony that everybody's involved in. Why is it important? I mean, yeah, you got to get up and work that day, but it's also part of you understanding the larger context of it, isn't it? What happens at the end of each day? Taps. What's that for? The workday is done. The vigilance isn't over, but the workday is done, right? And so all of those things are ceremony. So it's time for them to have a ceremony. They just spent some time rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah wants them to understand this was an important accomplishment. And so beginning at verse 27, it says, "Now at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites from all their places to bring them to Jerusalem." So the chapters before were talking about, we got to get everybody, settled in their place. But now we got to get them all back together so that we can have this big ceremony around the wall. So they might celebrate the dedication with gladness, with hymns of thanksgiving, and with songs to the accompaniments of cymbals and harps and lyres. So the sons of the singers were assembled from the district around Jerusalem and from the villages of the Netethanites, and from Bilgal and the fields of Geba and Azareth, and all those places are just areas around Jerusalem. For the singers had built themselves villages around Jerusalem. I kind of got the impression with this that they're not going too far afield, right? If they got to come in there and work on it, they're going to be kind of within easy travel distance or, fairly close by. But they're taking it seriously. This is going to be part of the ceremony. And then in verse 30, it says that the priests and the Levites purified themselves. They also purified the people and the gates and the wall. What do you think it means when it says they purified them? What would that consist of?
Did they have ritual cleansings and stuff?
They had a number of ritual cleansings that they might go through. They had that, and remember, even on multiple things in the Old Testament, there were times when simply to be ritually clean as dedicated to God, they would wash something. They would then sprinkle it with the ashes of purification, the water that they made there from the red heifer. They also would offer sacrifices and sprinkle blood on things. There was all number of rituals that they would go through. But what was the idea behind all of that? Who is it they're dedicating to? It's to God. And so it was a public dedication of first the Levites, as we're setting an example. We're going to be servants, right? And then it says all the people, and so they're dedicating them. But then then they go into, it's time to dedicate the very walls and the gates and everything that they've just built. And so they're going to go through ceremonies to do that. And part of that is getting all the people together. And if you look down in verse 31, it says, "Then I had the leaders of Judah come up on top of the wall and appointed two great choirs, the first proceeding to the right on top of the wall toward the refuse gate, and Hoshaiah and half the leaders of Judah followed them." And then it lists a whole bunch of names, and it gives kind of their route. And then in verse 38, it says, "The second choir proceeded to the left, while I followed them with half the people on the wall." And then it starts listing a bunch of the places that they went. So it's kind of interesting here. Best we can tell, this kind of means they started here at the Valley Gate. Now remember when Ezra was reading the law, they were over here at the Water Gate, which is kind of on this side. So it's just kind of on the opposite side of the wall, but still part of this skinny piece that's there. The temple is up in this area. So these folks are marching this way. These folks are marching down around this way. There's some ambiguity about how much of the wall they covered. It kind of sounds like, though, they're trying to circle the city from both sides and get around and meet at the top, which would be the gate where the temple would be, right? So what's the point of that? And if you think about who they've got, each one, if you go down through it, they've got a Thanksgiving choir is the literal interpretation of that. So what's that consist of? Remember all those singers that were getting together? Okay. So that's the choir. They got a bunch of people singing. And now we've got 7 priests with trumpets that are with them. We've got a prominent one of the leaders. Nehemiah is with one group, and this other guy named Hoshaiah is with another group. I figured that they were splitting it and marching halfway with each of them, because if they'd have taken the whole group around the whole wall, it would have taken all day long. And they were just kind of, getting it covered while saving a little bit of time there. And then they've got a director of music that's listed, and they've got 8 Levitical musicians that are listed. Can you picture this is the parade that's going here? So we've got a leader out front. We've got 7 priests with trumpets. 1 trumpet can make a loud noise. How about 7 trumpets? Okay? Are people in the city going to hear this coming? This is a parade, folks. And what is everybody else doing, you think, while this ceremony is going on? They're lined up all around the wall just like a parade route, right? They're all inside and outside the wall waiting for these folks to come by as they come and celebrate each section of the wall and each gate. And that's where it goes down and lists them. And they went from here, and they went from here, and they went from here. And to me, it's like this dedication parade ceremony where they're going. They've got their songs that they're singing, their praise to God that they're singing, and they meet finally up at the temple. So we got Ezra the scribe went before them, and down in verse 36. We got the 2 choirs that are mentioned there in verse 40. And then on verse 44, "On that day the men were also appointed over the chambers of the stores." So there's this dedication ceremony, and then as part of that, I think they're also saying, now here's the people that are going to be in charge of all of this. Okay? So we got the build-up, and then the appointment of specific people to take care of the details. All of this to line up to make sure that people understood that the city was going to be functional. So it's interesting that they spend a whole chapter on that. And when you get down and verse 45, actually I'll start back in 44. "On that day the men were also appointed over the chamber for the stores, the contributions, the firstfruits, the tithes, to gather them in from the fields and the cities, the portions required by the law for the priests and the Levites. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who served. For they performed the worship of their God and the service of purification together with the singers and the gatekeepers in accordance with the command of David and his son Solomon. For in the days of David and Asaph in ancient times, there were leaders of the singers, songs of praise and hymns of thanksgiving to God. So all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah gave the portions due the singers and the gatekeepers as each day required, and set apart the consecrated portion for the Levites, and the Levites set apart the consecrated portion for the sons of Aaron." Now, there's one phrase in there that when I first read it, I kind of went, oh, wait. And he says, in ancient times this happened. We think about it as it's all ancient times, right? But for the writer, for Nehemiah, who's probably writing this, he's talking about ancient times way back with David. It's been a long time since 1000 AD when David reigned, right? And here we are close to 400 AD when they're kind of getting this all back together. And so for him, the reign of David was ancient times. And yet he's looking back on it going, but we're getting it reestablished. And you remember the prophets when they were in captivity, one of the things they talked about was getting things back together. There was going to be a return from captivity. They were going to have this new hope of all of the things that they would reestablish. And so I have a feeling that that's part of what they're looking for here. They're wondering, is this it? Are we coming back? They would have thought this was just the nucleus, just the small beginning. But doesn't it sound like, from the way it's going, that they're dedicated? This is going to happen. They've got everything set up. What could go wrong? And then it ends there, and you pick up in chapter 13. And for me, chapter 13 was one of the most interesting chapters of the whole book, because we've gone through now these 4 sections of all the things they were trying to do and all the problems they had and all the difficulties, and it seems like with this dedication of the walls, we're finally getting things together. But Nehemiah gets called back. Nehemiah, remember in the very first part when he asked the king, Artaxerxes, to go, he said, how long are you going to be gone? Well, it turns out it was going to be a few years, but he's going to get called back. So he was governor for some period of time. He went to Jerusalem in the 20th year of the reign of the king, but he was called back to Susa in the 32nd year. So imagine that chapter 12 kind of ends just before Nehemiah gets called back. How long he's gone, we don't know. Probably at least a couple of years, but somewhere in that kind of time frame. But we're closing in. We're closing in on the end of the prophecies for this period. We're closing in on the end of the historical sequence that we know for the old law. And then Nehemiah is going to come back for a second term as governor. In chapter 13, talks about what he found. On that day, and I think it immediately follows chapter 12, the dedication there, but I think as we go on, you'll see that this is kind of in the context of him coming back, as I think. On that day, they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So when they heard the law, they excluded all the foreigners from Israel. Now, prior to that reading of that law, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah. Does that name ring a bell? Okay, this is the guy that gave him misery while they're trying to rebuild everything, right? He's kind of the governor up in Samaria. They had prepared a large room for him where formerly they put the grain offerings and frankincense and the utensils and the tithes of the grain, wine and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contributions. But during all this time, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king. After some time, however, I asked leave for the king, and I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. It was very displeasing to me, so I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room, and then I gave an order, and they cleaned the rooms, and I returned there the utensils of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. So, here's Nehemiah. When he left after the dedication of the wall, he's thinking, that was 12 years of hard work. But I think we're good. We're in pretty good shape here, right? But I got to go report back to the king. Some period of time, he comes back later. What do you think Nehemiah is expecting to find when he gets back home? What's his mindset going to be as he's on his horses with other Persian soldiers riding and he sees Jerusalem on the mountain? I think he's waiting to see progress. You know, we had everything in order. This should be good. And the first thing he finds is what? As he heads up towards the temple. That Tobiah guy, the son now lives here now, inside the temple complex. In fact, an area where they should have been storing things that were brought in, he's got his own personal effects there, and that's where he's living. So what's Nehemiah's gentle response to that? Just throw it all out, okay? I can see him just kind of, we're going to clean this place out, and I'm hoping that it was one of those places that had one of those windows that overlooked the hill, you know, so so you could just kind of clean house and shovel it over the side. I mean, if I were Nehemiah, that's what I would have felt like doing. Clean it all out. But then he is just appalled because they should have known better, and I think that's what the first part of that chapter is. No Moabite or Edomite is supposed to be in that area. And here they've got one living there who's now related to the priest somehow. But it begs a question, and you go, wait a second. If this guy's occupying one of the rooms that was supposed to be a storeroom for all the stuff coming in, well, we got a little problem because it says, I also discovered that the portions of the Levites who had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. So I reprimanded the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? Then I gathered them together and restored them to their posts, and all Judah them brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and the oil into the storehouses. And in charge of the storehouses I appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah of the Levites, and in addition to them was Hanan of Zochar and the son of Matthiah, and they were considered reliable as it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds which I have performed for the house of my God and its services. You read that last line, and I'm beginning to see some despair in Nehemiah. When you think about the commitments that they had, this covenant renewal that they had in chapter 10, and one of the things that they said there was, we're going to support the temple. Lots of space dedicated to that. They're going to bring things in, they're going to do it. Nehemiah leaves for a year, 2 years, whatever it happens to be, and he comes back. What's missing? They totally misused the temple rooms. They're not supplying the Levites. They were supposed to support the Levites. That was right there in that covenant that they signed. We will support the Levites. We'll bring them their stuff. And he says, no, that hasn't happened. We're not even, we're at batting zero here so far of the things they promised to do. But he continues. In those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Now, I want to stop there for a second, because there's both good and bad in that statement. Remember, we've been talking about what the king wanted was reestablishing some of the economy and getting things going. Does it sound like they've been making some progress in that area? Because they're bringing in all this stuff. You don't get that without a lot of work. So they've got harvests. They're bringing, they've got all of that. What's the problem with it? On the Sabbath. Okay, here we are. Again, that covenant that they all signed said they were going to honor the Sabbath. How's that looking so far? Missing it again. So here's this return from captivity with the remnant and Nehemiah and Ezra and others who had just spent their lives and their fortunes and their time trying to get this going, and the hope that they had for it. And in each little detail, what's happening? They're falling short. They're not sticking to the commitment that they made. They're not really dedicated to God, are they? Because they've let all of this go. Also, men of Tyre were living there who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Now, I'm telling you once again, from a commerce standpoint, what this means is they've got enough economic wealth being generated that they're able to afford foreign merchants coming in. Now, Tyre's not that far away, but that means they're bringing stuff in from Tyre to sell there in Jerusalem. That's a good thing, right? Getting economy going. What's the problem? It's on the Sabbath again. So it's not just that they were doing it themselves. They've invited everybody else in to do it. They've given everybody cause to be not on the right page with their God. So here's Nehemiah again, faced with this. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. It came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and they should not open them until after the Sabbath. Then I stationed some of my servants at the gates so that no load would enter on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside Jerusalem. And then I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will use force against you. And from that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also, remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me according to the greatness of your loving kindness. Again, I visualize this. Why were they camped outside after he said, look, close the gates on the Sabbath day? Why is everybody still camped outside with all their wares?
Some baskets.
You know, and he says, I had to station some of my people at all the gates. We got some smuggling going on here, folks. You know, if somebody wasn't watching them, they're going to do it anyway, right? And so he's going, I had to put my own people on the gates. So you can read into this that while they're kind of giving lip service to Nehemiah here, if he weren't enforcing things, what would happen? It's just going back to the way they were doing it before. So people are going to park outside the gates like, yeah, we've been here before. Give them a few days. It'll all change. Nehemiah is saying, not on my watch. But when you think about the way that prayer is offered, that little short one-verse prayer there, we might think of it as this way: Lord, I'm really trying, but these are tough people. And please remember me for what I tried to do. Because to Nehemiah, is it looking like he's succeeding? I mean, think back of when he first had to go before the king and what his goal was and the fear and trepidation that he had to even go before the Persian king. And he gets before this king. And the king says, yeah, go get this city going. And take Ezra with you, you know? And let's get this back to something that's following the laws of your God. Remember that? How's it going? Nehemiah is at the end of his rope. Number 3, they're still working on the Sabbath. And in those days I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod and Ammon and Moab, and as for their children, half spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them were able to speak in the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God and by marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Hornite. So I drove him away from me. I want to say the last there for a second, but remember when we left at the dedication of the wall, there was a whole bunch of people that he put in charge of things, and he said they're mostly reliable. Turns out mostly reliable. Seth?
Were these forbidden because they weren't proselytes? Like they hadn't been dedicated to God and said, hey, I want to live like it.
Good question. When he says none of the ones from Moab, for example, would come into the assembly, do we know a very famous Moabitess who was a faithful believer in God? Absolutely, Ruth. So yes, that was the distinction. If they gave up their foreign gods and proclaimed that Jehovah was the only God and they would follow him and they would proselyte in and become a member of the land, then they could become part of Israel. They were then included as part of Israel. And that had been true from the time they left Egypt. There were even Egyptians that came with them that wound up agreeing to the covenant as Moses laid it out and were counted as the sons of Israel. And they were called the foreigners among them. You'll see that in several phrases as you go through the histories. But these people weren't doing that. When he says they didn't speak the language, what's he really referring to there? How much training do you think they had in God's word at that point? None. They couldn't even speak the language that they were speaking in the temple because the moms weren't teaching them that, which clearly showed they weren't interested in being part of Israel, right? So that's the problem, is they're inviting these people in, and that's when he's talking about Solomon. He said, we got a good example of what happens when you do this, right? Now remember that fourth thing that they said that they were going to do in that covenant renewal? That they weren't going to do that? Well, here we are. So of the 4 main points in the covenant renewal, how many of them did they keep? 0. That's an interesting way. When I look at this history and you read this last chapter, what a way to end the historical record that we have as we come up to that time frame of what's now going to begin 400 years of what we call silence. From this time until John the Baptist shows up, God doesn't talk to him anymore. There's no prophets. There's some interesting things that happened during that period, and we had a class on the intertestamental period, but this is how it closes out. Verse 29, remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each in his own task. And I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the firstfruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. Did you see a progression as you read through there on Nehemiah? How frustrated does it show that Nehemiah got when he finally faced this bit with the foreign women? What's he do? You know, anytime you're grabbing somebody's beard and pulling their hair out, I think that's an example of being very frustrated. You know how Mark says sometimes you feel like just grabbing somebody and shaking them a bit? Nehemiah didn't hold back. He did that. He grabbed them and shook them a bit, pulled out their beard and said, what are you doing? But when the night comes and he has to survey his work, and he's dedicated so many years, and this is closing out, indications are he probably had to go back to Persia again. This was a temporary assignment, and this was kind of back for just a review time. What is he going to be thinking when he kind of gathers his folks and heads back to Persia? What is his hope for the land at that point?
That it'll continue on and like how we try to get them to go back to God.
I think he's hoping that it will, but I think he's seeing that this is just not looking good, is it? Not looking good at all.
Seems like he's resigned to like, here, look what they did when I was already gone away. It'll probably happen again, but Father, please look what I've done and tried to do.
Exactly. So when you get to the end, what's the only thing that Nehemiah can bring before his God? His actions and his deeds. And in coming to a realization that he can't control anyone else, but what can he do? He says, remember me, God, for what I tried to do. I may not have been successful, but I tried. And isn't that really all any of us get to do at some point? Is to stand before God and at least be able to honestly say, I hope that we tried. had our failings, and just be on the mercy of God, because I think Nehemiah wanted to succeed in this, but he didn't. But that's not, it's interesting how that tie goes in. And so next week, we're end of our time for this class period, but next week what I want to do is in the book of Malachi, which when we look at our timeline is contemporary with Nehemiah. I want to look at some of the things that were said there, because it kind of wraps it up. We've got Ezra, Nehemiah, and then we've got Malachi, which was the last prophet. And I think you'll see some of the echoes of what we studied in Ezra, Nehemiah from a historical standpoint, voiced as the prophet to kind of let us know that God understood what was really going on. So we'll look at that next week. Thank you.